This is what the crowd did to Mussolini's mistress at Piazzale Loreto. Everyone knows how Mussolini died. Everyone's seen the photo of him hanging upside down at a gas station. But almost nobody outside Italy knows what happened to the young woman hanging right next to him. Her name was Claretta Petacci. She was 33, she was gorgeous, she was his mistress. And a Milan crowd of thousands stood underneath her body for 9 hours and did things you won't find in any history book, until one young partisan girl walked into the middle of it with a safety pin. First, let's talk about that truck. The truck itself is the first weird thing. It isn't a military truck or a funeral car, it's just a yellow furniture van, the kind you'd rent to move an apartment across town. And it's rolling through empty Milan streets at 3 in the morning on a wet Sunday. In the back are 18 dead bodies stacked on top of each other like laundry. It stops at Piazzale Loreto. 5 roads meet in this square, and it's a huge open roundabout, dead quiet at that hour. The driver kills the engine. 10 partisans jump out of the back and lift the tarp, and they start throwing bodies onto the stone. They don't lay them down nicely, they just tip them out. 16 men, 1 dictator, and 1 woman spill onto the wet cobblestones. The last body out is Claretta. Her black curly hair falls over her face when they drop her next to Mussolini's hand. Now here's the wild part. She didn't have to be there. Her whole family had escaped to Spain months earlier and begged her to come with them. She stayed with him anyway. She'd told friends over and over that she was meant to die with Mussolini. On April 28th, when partisans grabbed them together at Lake Como, she got her wish. She threw herself in front of him when the shooter raised his gun. She caught the bullets meant for the dictator. She was 33 years old, and by 4 in the morning, the first people in Milan were starting to hear the news. It spread the way news spreads in a city with no phones. It went mouth to mouth, apartment to apartment, in whispers on the stairs. Il Duce è morto. The Duke is dead, and he's lying in Piazzale Loreto. Bakers heading to work heard it first. After that came trash collectors, a barber, and somebody's grandmother in her nightgown, running down the street in slippers to see for herself. By 5, there were 200 people in the square. By 6, 1,000. By 7, all of Milan was squeezing into that traffic circle. Nobody was crying and nobody was praying. They were just staring at the pile of bodies on the stone. Right around the time the sun came up, somebody spat on the pile. That was the first spit. And that's the exact moment it stopped being a liberation and turned into something a lot uglier. Because a real mob doesn't roar all at once. It builds up slowly in tiny steps. Somebody spits, then somebody laughs, then somebody kicks, and pretty soon everybody's kicking at once. That's how the ritual starts. That's how humans tell each other it's finally okay to do the thing they've been dreaming about for years. However, what Milan had been dreaming about for 8 straight months wasn't just anger. It was something bigger. It was payback for a horror that had happened in this exact same square. But there's a reason they picked Piazzale Loreto. Because 8 months earlier, on this exact same stone, something almost identical had happened. Except that time it was in reverse. It was August 10th, 1944, at 5:45 in the morning. 15 young anti-fascist prisoners got dragged out of San Vittore prison. Most of them were just kids. They were driven to Piazzale Loreto, lined up against the wall, and shot dead by a fascist firing squad. The order came from a Nazi named Theo Saevecke, the head of the Gestapo in Milan. The excuse was a partisan bombing 2 days earlier that had killed 6 regular Italian people and 0 German soldiers. It didn't really matter. 15 young Italians got machine-gunned at dawn as punishment. However, the killing wasn't the point. The display was the point. Because after they shot them, the fascists left the 15 bodies rotting in the sun in Piazzale Loreto all day long. Kids walked past them on their way to school, and women had to shop around them. That whole scene was a warning that said, "Look what happens to you if you fight us." And Mussolini himself, when he heard about it, actually saw what was coming. He knew that image was going to poison Milan against him forever. He said this out loud. And this is his real quote to the deputy head of his own police. He said, "Per il sangue di Piazzale Loreto pagheremo caro." For the blood of Piazzale Loreto, we'll pay dearly. The dictator predicted his own death, and he named the exact spot where it would happen. 8 full, awful months later, his prediction came true. It was the same square, the same stone, the same time of morning, just with different bodies on the ground. And this time, the crowd wasn't grieving. This time, the crowd had come to party. The partisan commanders knew exactly what they were doing when they told that yellow truck to drive to Piazzale Loreto. They could have dumped Mussolini in any square in Milan. They picked this one on purpose. They picked the address of the 15 martyrs. And they laid Il Duce down on the same stones where those kids had bled out. It was an eye for an eye, biblical Old Testament stuff. It was public and symbolic, and nobody in Italy could miss the message. Claretta was in the pile because she'd refused to leave the man who caused all of it. And what a crowd was about to do to her body, no love story on earth has ever prepared a person for. Because in Italian, the crowd wasn't going to call her mistress. They weren't going to call her partner either. They were going to call her puttana. And puttana really only means one thing in Italian, and that thing is whore. However, that word wasn't going to fly for another 2 hours. First, the crowd wanted Mussolini himself, and they had 22 years of anger stored up. By dawn, all of Milan was in that square. By 6 in the morning, the square was packed. By 8, you couldn't move. Streetcars stopped running because they couldn't push through the crowd. People were climbing the lampposts, and kids were sitting on their father's shoulders. Somebody brought a folding chair. Somebody else brought a camera to take photos. And the bodies were still just lying there in a pile. Then somebody walked up to Mussolini's body and kicked him hard in the head. The whole square went dead quiet for a second. Then somebody else kicked him. After that, another person spat on him. Someone threw a dead cat that landed on his chest. A woman ran up and stomped on his face with the heel of her shoe. That was the dam breaking. They threw insults at him. They threw vegetables, rotten cabbage, tomatoes, whatever was in the market. They pissed on the dead body of the man who'd been their god for 20 years. Multiple eyewitnesses saw grown men opening their pants, standing over Il Duce's head, and urinating on him while grinning at their friends. They kicked him so hard, so many times, that by 9, his face wasn't even a face anymore. His nose was gone, his skin was black and purple with bruising, and both eyes were swollen shut. However, the crowd wasn't trying to hurt him. The crowd was letting go. 22 years of fascist beatings, of castor oil torture, of sons who disappeared into prisons, was all coming out of the boots and fists of a Milan crowd on a Sunday morning. However, the wildest thing that morning was still coming. Because right around then, one very specific woman walked into the square with a revolver in her pocket. Nobody caught her name. She was small, middle-aged, dressed like any Italian mother. She pushed through the crowd, pulled a service revolver out of her coat, and stood over Mussolini's body, and she emptied every round into his corpse. 5 shots, into a dead man, at close range. She screamed a number in Italian with every shot, loud enough for the whole square to hear. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then she turned to the crowd and yelled it. 5 colpi per I miei 5 figli assassinati. 5 shots for my 5 murdered sons. The whole square went dead silent. Then the whole square cheered like a soccer stadium. And after that, the whole square got a lot worse. Because if a mother of 5 dead sons could stand over Il Duce and shoot him 5 times, well, what was anybody else waiting for? Everyone in Milan with a score to settle got in line. A guy beat Mussolini's chest with a hammer. Women pulled out chunks of his hair. Men jumped up and down on his ribcage until his stomach ripped open. People in the crowd said you could smell it from 20 feet away. The New York Times reporter in the crowd wrote it into the morning edition. He said the man who once boasted he'd restore ancient Rome was now a corpse in a public square, with a howling mob cursing him and spitting on his body. That was the wire copy the whole world would read the next day. However, this was all still happening to Mussolini. Claretta was down there in the pile, half buried under other bodies. Her skirt was already riding up, her stockings were torn, and her face was in the dirt. Nobody had really touched her yet, because Mussolini was the trophy. Claretta was going to be the second act. And that's when the crowd turned toward Claretta. She was the only woman in the pile. For 22 years, Mussolini had preached family values and Catholic morality, and here at the end of it, hanging on the dictator's arm like a war medal, was a rich young girl from Rome with perfect skin and expensive shoes. Milan wasn't just angry at Mussolini. Milan was angry at her, because Rachele Mussolini, the actual wife, the mother of Il Duce's 5 real children, was in Como that same morning, being held by American troops. Every Italian housewife knew about Claretta. Every Italian housewife hated her. And here she was, the mistress, still curled up next to Il Duce even in death. Someone in the crowd yelled it first, "La puttana!" The whore. And the word spread through the square like a match hitting oil. They pulled her body out of the pile. Her expensive black shoes, size 33, were already gone, taken by someone in the truck. Her feet were bare. Her cream-coloured blouse was ripped open to the waist. Her chest was covered in bullet holes and dried blood. She looked like something out of a horror story. Then they dragged her by her ankles across the wet stone. This is where the whole morning shifts. Up until now, it had been a mob venting on a dead dictator. Now it was a mob venting on a woman. And a crowd hates 2 things more than almost anything else on earth: a tyrant and the woman who slept with him. Claretta, dead and silent and unable to defend herself, was about to take both barrels at once. They started hoisting her up. The plan was to hang her upside down, right next to Mussolini, from the metal beam of the Esso gas station on the corner of the square. The gas station was half built. It was about to become a public gallows. Somebody threaded a rope around her ankles. Somebody yanked on it hard, and she went up slowly, head first toward the pavement. Then her skirt fell. Because when you hang a woman upside down, gravity does what gravity does. Her skirt slid up from her ankles all the way to her waist, and the crowd underneath saw the truth. She was wearing silk stockings and a pink garter belt, and absolutely nothing else. She hadn't been wearing underwear when she died, and the reason for it hits you in the gut. She hadn't had the time. When the partisans came for her and Mussolini before the execution, she'd thrown on whatever was on the chair. She managed to grab a shirt and a skirt, but she didn't have time for underwear. So there she was, 12 hours after being shot to death, hanging upside down over a gas pump, and the crowd could see everything. The Italian historian Edgardo Ferri wrote down what happened next. As Claretta went up, the crowd made a sound that was half laughter and half filthy cheer, and one voice, above all the others, yelled it loud enough for the whole square to hear, "Non ha le mutande!" She's not wearing panties. The laugh that went around Piazzale Loreto at that moment is the laugh that still haunts Italy. Because it wasn't political anymore. It wasn't liberation anymore. It was thousands of people looking up a dead woman's skirt and enjoying it. Whatever moral high ground the partisans had at 3 a.m. evaporated at the sound of that laugh. However, somebody in that crowd wasn't laughing. Her name was Carla la Bionda. Her real name was Piera Barale, and she was a young partisan courier. Her code name was Carla la Bionda, which means blonde Carla. She'd fought in the resistance, and she'd lost people to Il Duce's war. And she was standing directly under Claretta's swinging body when the skirt fell and the whole crowd started to laugh. Then she did something nobody else in that whole square was going to do. She reached down to her own dress. She took off a spilla da balia, a safety pin, the kind Italian women used to carry in those days for emergencies. Then she pushed her way through the crowd, past the laughing men, past the people spitting, until she reached a partisan chaplain named Don Giuseppe Pollarolo. He was a Catholic priest. He'd been walking with the partisans through the whole war. He was standing right near the bodies. Piera gave him the pin and said something quiet. and Don Pollarolo asked the men hoisting Claretta up to pause for one moment, just for 1 second. The men actually paused. The whole crowd noticed too. The laughter died down for a second, out of pure confusion. Then Don Pollarolo, this partisan priest in his black robe covered in truck dust, reached up. He grabbed the hem of Claretta's blood-soaked skirt. He pulled it down between her legs and pinned it there with Piera's safety pin. This way, when she went up the rest of the way, she'd have her modesty even in death. The photograph that went around the world the next morning is that exact photo. You've probably seen it in a history book. It shows Claretta hanging upside down, chest full of blood, hair swinging in the wind, and her skirt pinned neatly between her legs. That safety pin belongs to Piera Barale. That gesture belongs to a partisan chaplain. And it's the only moment of grace in the whole 9 hours of Piazzale Loreto. Now, a few careful historians say the Piera Barale story may be a bit polished. Bosworth, the main English biographer of Claretta, calls it possibly romanticized. However, every source agrees on the main fact. At some point that morning, somebody in that square pinned her skirt. Whether it was Piera and Don Pollarolo or 2 anonymous strangers doesn't change what happened. Somebody looked at that hanging body and decided a woman deserved better than a laugh. And here's a detail almost nobody outside of Italy knows about the whole story. When they later dug Claretta's body up, after the war, they found something sewn into the shoulder pads of her shirt. A small antique diamond ring. A gold locket studded with 17 tiny diamonds spelling out the letters C and B. Inside the locket, there was a tiny handwritten note in her own writing. It said, "Clara, io sono te, e tu sei me." Clara, I am you, and you are me. And there was a date from 24th of April, 1932 to 24th of April, 1941. That was their private anniversary. She'd been carrying his love letter, sewn into her own clothes, on the day the crowd stripped her naked upside down in a Milan square. That's the level of loyalty. That's the level of tragedy. And that's what the crowd, laughing at her exposed body, had no idea it was looking at. However, right at that moment, the whole morning was about to get even weirder, because someone else was being dragged into the square right in front of the crowd, and that person was still very much alive. That man was Achille Starace. The crowd barely noticed at first, because they were still busy tearing apart the pile of bodies. He was the former secretary of the National Fascist Party. He was one of the men who'd built the whole Mussolini myth. He was the guy who'd invented the fascist salute rules, the marching drills, all of it. And when the partisans caught him that morning, he was out for a jog in downtown Milan, on the day his Duce was hanging in Piazzale Loreto. Nobody has ever explained his logic. Somebody recognized him mid-run, and somebody else grabbed him on the street. He was tried on the spot, sentenced to death, and dragged into the square. The partisans marched him right up to Mussolini's disfigured corpse. They told him, "Salute your Duce." And Starace actually did it. He clicked his heels together. He raised his right arm in the fascist salute he'd personally designed. He looked at the mangled body of his boss and said, "My Duce." He threw the Roman salute one last time. Then a 4-man firing squad shot him in the back, and he fell into the pile with the others. They strung him up next to Mussolini. So now the Esso gas station beam had Bombacci, Mussolini, Claretta, Pavolini, and Starace. 5 bodies swinging in a row over gas pumps that would never work again. But by 1 in the afternoon, somebody finally shut the whole thing down. It was Cardinal Alfredo Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan, the same priest Mussolini had gone to for a last-ditch peace meeting just 4 days earlier. Schuster picked up a phone and called the American military government that had just arrived. He told them, "This has to stop right now." The American commanders agreed. US soldiers pushed into the square, cleared the crowd, and took the bodies down. They were loaded into wooden coffins and driven to the city morgue. Mussolini's autopsy came back later that day. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall, 158 pounds, with 7 to 9 bullets in him and 4 near his heart. However, that wasn't even the strangest thing the doctors did. A piece of his brain was quietly cut out and shipped to a psychiatric hospital in Washington. American doctors wanted to know if fascism showed up in brain tissue. It never really did.